The vault door groaned shut, sealing the world away. Inside, the air tasted of cold copper and stagnant dust. Marcus stood at the center of his domain, surrounded by mountains of gold that shimmered in the dim, flickering light. He reached out, his fingers brushing the sharp, intricate edge of a ruby-encrusted goblet. The metal was biting, icy against his skin. He traced the rim, waiting for the familiar surge of pride, but his chest remained hollow, a cavernous void that no amount of bullion could fill. He turned to a chest overflowing with coins and plunged his hands into the pile. The gold clattered, a harsh, metallic sound that died instantly. He pulled his hands back, empty. The weight of his fortune felt like a physical burden, pressing down on his shoulders. He walked to the iron door and threw the bolt. The click echoed through the chamber like a gavel striking stone. Marcus looked up at the ceiling, eyes searching the shadows for a sense of purpose that never arrived. Outside, the village was silent. The silence shattered. A sharp, rhythmic rapping echoed against the heavy iron door, vibrating through the floorboards of the vault. Marcus stiffened, his hand hovering over a pile of gold. Nobody approached this door. He strode to the entrance, unbolted the heavy lock, and swung it wide. A man stood on the threshold, leaning on a gnarled wooden staff. His skin was mapped with deep lines, and his boots were heavy with dried mud. He did not bow. He did not look at the gold. He looked directly into Marcus's eyes. "I hear you are the richest man," the visitor said. Marcus puffed his chest, his jaw tightening as he gestured to the overflowing chests behind him. "I have everything," he replied. The visitor tilted his head, a faint, knowing smile touching his lips. "I knew a man who had more than you," the visitor countered, "and he died a ghost." The words hung in the air, heavier than the gold surrounding them. Marcus felt a flicker of unease, a small, cold point of doubt beginning to bloom. Marcus let out a sharp, dismissive laugh, but the sound felt brittle in the vast, quiet room. The wanderer did not flinch. Instead, he reached into the depths of his bag and pulled out a weathered, yellowed scroll. The parchment crackled as he unrolled it, revealing intricate ink lines that seemed to pulse under the dim light. "A king once lost his entire empire," the wanderer whispered, "and in the ruins he found true wealth. It is not here, among these cold piles of metal." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. The greed he had spent a lifetime cultivating flared, hot and demanding, overriding his initial skepticism. He looked at the map, then back at the wanderer. "What do you want for it?" Marcus asked, his voice tight. The wanderer pointed a calloused finger at the ruby-encrusted goblet sitting on the pedestal. "Trade me your finest ruby, and I will show you the path to that lost empire." Marcus did not hesitate. He snatched the goblet, twisted the gemstone free, and felt its weight a heavy, burning red in his palm. He held it out, his fingers trembling slightly as the wanderer reached for it. The first light of dawn bled over the horizon, turning the village rooftops into silhouettes of gray and charcoal. Marcus stood outside his vault, the heavy iron door locked behind him for the last time. He had packed a leather bag with his most portable gold, the coins clinking with a dull, rhythmic thud against his hip. He slung the strap over his shoulder, and the weight hit him instantly. It was a physical, biting pressure that dug into his skin. He winced, shifting the bag, but the metal edges pressed harder against his frame. The wanderer waited at the edge of the village. He did not offer to help. He did not even look back as Marcus stumbled forward, his boots catching on the uneven stones. Each step sent a jolt of resistance through his body. The bag swung, a pendulum of dead weight that pulled him off balance. He tightened his grip on the strap, gritted his teeth against the biting sting of the leather, and pushed forward into the morning mist. By midday, the sun hung heavy and white in the sky, baking the road into a fine, gray powder. Every step Marcus took sent a plume of grit swirling upward, coating his throat and stinging his eyes. He coughed, a dry, hacking sound that felt alien in the stillness of the open country. His shoulder throbbed where the leather strap bit into his skin, the weight of the gold now a constant, grinding pressure. He stopped, chest heaving, and wiped a layer of grime from his forehead. A merchant cart creaked in the distance, a shadow of comfort he desperately craved. Marcus turned to the wanderer, his voice raspy and demanding. "Hire a carriage. I will pay double to be rid of this heat." The wanderer did not stop. He kept his steady, rhythmic pace, his boots kicking up clouds of dust that settled on Marcus like a shroud. "The path requires your own feet," the old man called back, his tone devoid of pity. Marcus realized, for the first time, that his status meant nothing to the road. The road ended abruptly at the edge of a ravine, where the river cut through the bedrock like a jagged silver scar. The water was not a gentle stream. It was a churning, white-knuckled torrent that roared against the boulders, spraying a fine, icy mist into the air. Marcus stopped dead. He looked at the swirling vortex of the current, then back at the dry, dusty path they had traveled. He clutched the leather bag against his chest, his knuckles white, his grip frantic. The wanderer did not hesitate. He waded into the shallows, his staff probing the slick, submerged rocks. The water rose instantly to his knees, pulling at his legs with a violent, rhythmic force. He looked back, his face unreadable in the spray. "The path goes through, not around," the old man shouted over the roar. Marcus stood on the bank, the wind biting at his skin, his mind racing. He stepped forward, then recoiled as the freezing water surged over his boots. He took a breath, the cold air stinging his lungs, and stepped in again. The water hit his shins, numbing the skin in seconds. He felt the weight of the bag dragging against his shoulder. The current surged, a wall of liquid ice that hammered against Marcus's chest. He tightened his grip on the leather bag, but the wet hide was slick, sliding through his numb fingers like a living thing. "Leave it!" the wanderer shouted, his voice barely cutting through the roar of the rapids. Marcus tried to pull the strap tighter, but the weight shifted violently. With a sharp snap, the leather gave way. The bag swung wide, caught the full force of the churning water, and was ripped from his grasp. Marcus lunged, his hand plunging into the freezing torrent, but he felt only the empty drag of the current. He watched, eyes wide, as the bag tumbled into the dark, swirling depths, the last of his fortune vanishing beneath the white foam. He stood frozen, his arms still held out, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was empty. He was exposed. He was furious. He scrambled toward the far bank, his boots slipping on the slick, submerged stones. He hauled himself onto the mud, gasping, his body shaking with a violent, uncontrollable tremor. He looked back at the river, his hands empty, his skin raw from the cold. He expected to feel hollow, yet as he stood and wiped the river water from his face, his lungs expanded with a sharp, clean intake of air. The road wound through a series of villages where the mud clung to their boots like heavy clay. In one settlement, the structures leaned against each other as if for support, their walls weathered by years of rain. The wanderer pushed open a door that groaned on rusted hinges. Inside, the air was thick with the steam of a single pot of thin, watery soup. A family sat on the floor, their movements slow and deliberate. Rain dripped steadily through a hole in the thatch roof, splashing into a wooden bucket with a rhythmic, hollow sound. The father caught the drips in a cup, passing it to a child who laughed as the water splashed his nose. Marcus stood in the doorway, his skin still prickling from the river's cold, his eyes darting from the damp, peeling walls to the empty bowls. There was no gold here. There were no vaults. There was only the sound of rain and the steady, bubbling heat of the soup. The family shared the meager meal, their faces illuminated by the dim light of a small, flickering hearth. They spoke in low, rhythmic tones, their voices rising in sudden, genuine bursts of laughter that seemed to fill the cramped space. Marcus watched them, his brow furrowed, his hands hanging limp at his sides. He looked at the leaking roof, then back at the father, his mind struggling to grasp the logic of their ease. He could not find the source of their contentment, and the silence of his own confusion felt louder than the rain. Marcus stepped further into the room, his eyes scanning the bare corners. He gestured toward the leaking thatch and the thin, watery soup. "You have nothing," Marcus said, his voice sharp with a lifetime of calculation. "No reserves, no security. How can you sit here and laugh?" The father set his bowl down and looked at the rain pooling in the center of the floor. He did not look at Marcus. He looked at his children, who were busy tracing patterns in the damp dirt. "We have this moment," the father replied. He reached out, resting a hand on his daughter's shoulder, feeling the warmth of her skin. "The roof will hold until the morning. The soup is warm for now. We have the sound of the rain and the space to breathe." Marcus shifted his weight, his hands clenching into fists. He tried to measure the value of the room, to find the hidden asset, but there was no ledger, no inventory, no gold. Marcus stood silent, his mind racing to find a flaw in the logic. But the laughter of the children cut through his thoughts. The village faded into a gray smudge behind them, but the weight of the encounter remained. The wanderer turned toward the jagged spine of the mountains, his pace relentless. Marcus followed, his boots slipping on loose shale. Days blurred into weeks, and the mountains rose to meet them, cold and indifferent. The air grew thin, biting at his lungs with every inhalation. He tried to keep his head high, to maintain the posture of a man who owned the land, but the terrain demanded humility. A sharp thorn snagged his side, pulling a long, jagged tear through the fabric of his sleeve. He did not stop to mend it. A mile later, the wind caught the loose threads, shredding the remaining fabric until it hung in useless, fluttering ribbons. He stumbled over a root, his hands scraping against the granite, leaving streaks of red on the stone. He did not look for a bandage. The mountain did not care for his status, and the altitude stripped away the pretense of his former life. His muscles burned with a constant, dull ache that replaced the hollow sensation in his chest. He stopped looking at the horizon for a destination, and began watching only the patch of ground directly beneath his feet. The man who had once counted gold now counted heartbeats. The summit plateau stretched out, a flat expanse of rock beneath an endless, ink-black sky. Marcus dropped his pack and collapsed, his back hitting the cold stone. Above, the stars were not distant points of light. They were burning, pulsing fires that seemed to vibrate in the silence. He reached up, his fingers trembling, trying to trace the constellations. But his hand fell back, heavy and useless. He remembered the rubies and the gold in his vault, the way they had sat dead and heavy in their chests, reflecting nothing but the dim light of a torch. These stars burned with a brilliance that made his finest diamonds look like dull gray pebbles. He watched them for hours, the cold air biting at his skin, yet he did not move. The wanderer sat nearby, silent. His silhouette merged with the shadows of the rocks. A sudden, sharp dread tightened in Marcus's chest. He knew the cave was close. He knew what waited inside. The beauty of the sky began to feel like a warning, a vast, indifferent witness to the truth he was about to face. The stars were beautiful, but they were also cold, and he feared that the mirror in the cave would be colder still. He closed his eyes, but the light of the stars burned behind his lids. The wanderer rose, his joints popping in the stillness, and pointed toward a jagged fissure in the granite wall. It was a narrow, vertical scar in the mountain, barely wide enough for a man to pass through. Marcus stood up, his legs stiff from the long night on the stone. He looked at the fissure, then back at the horizon, but the wanderer was already moving. Marcus followed, his boots crunching on loose gravel as he stepped into the throat of the mountain. The transition was immediate. The wind, which had been a constant companion for weeks, vanished. The air grew heavy, smelling of damp earth and ancient, undisturbed dust. They navigated a winding, uneven corridor, their footsteps echoing against walls that seemed to absorb the light. The path opened suddenly into a circular chamber. In the center, standing upright against the back wall, was a single object. It was a mirror, framed in tarnished metal, reflecting nothing but the absolute absence of light. Marcus took a step forward. Marcus stepped forward, his boots dragging on the stone floor. The mirror stood before him, a tall, silvered slab, that seemed to drink the meager light of the cave. He raised his eyes, expecting to see the traveler who had climbed mountains and slept under the stars. Instead, the man in the glass stared back with a terrifying, hollow stillness. Marcus recoiled, his hand flying to his throat as if to anchor himself to reality. The face in the reflection was gaunt, the skin pulled tight over bone, but it was the eyes that stopped his breath. They were dull, flat, and devoid of any spark or recognition. There was no warmth in the set of his jaw, no memory of the laughter he had shared in the villages, and no trace of the man who had once been proud of his gold. It was a mask of absolute indifference, a portrait of a soul that had withered long before he reached this cave. He leaned closer, his forehead nearly touching the cold surface, searching for a flicker of life, a sign of the journey he had endured. He found nothing. The reflection was a stranger, a ghost trapped in a frame of tarnished metal. Marcus stood paralyzed, his own heartbeat the only sound in the suffocating dark, forced to confront the wreckage of his own identity staring back at him with dead, empty eyes. The silence in the chamber stretched, thin as wire. Marcus could not pull his gaze from the glass. He felt the wanderer move behind him, the sound of heavy boots scraping against the stone floor. A hand, calloused and rough, came to rest on his shoulder. The wanderer did not look at Marcus. He looked only at the reflection. "Look closely," the old man whispered, his voice vibrating against the cave walls. He raised a finger, tracing the outline of the man in the mirror. "That is the man who owned everything. He spent his years building walls of gold, yet he built nothing of himself." The wanderer shifted his grip, his fingers digging into the stone frame of the mirror. "And that," he continued, pointing to the hollow, gaunt face staring back, "is the man who had nothing." Marcus flinched as if struck. The words hung in the stale air, heavy and undeniable. The wanderer stepped back, his presence dimming in the shadows. "You carried the weight of the world in your bags, but you left your life in the dust of the road." Marcus turned his head, his eyes darting to the wanderer. The wanderer shifted his weight, and for the first time, his shoulders squared. The slump of his posture vanished, replaced by a rigid, ancient authority that filled the small cave. He reached out, his hand hovering inches from the glass, tracing the reflection of the man who had once been Marcus. "I was once that man," the wanderer said, his voice dropping to a resonant, steady bass. "I sat on a throne of gold and watched my empire turn to ash because I mistook accumulation for life." He turned to face Marcus. "Gold is a dead thing. It sits in vaults, it gathers dust, and it rots the hands that hold it too tightly." He gestured to the dark corners. "Memories are the only currency that breathes. They expand when shared, they grow warmer with time, and they are the only wealth that survives the grave." He tapped his chest, then pointed to Marcus's own reflection. "You spent your life hoarding metal that could not love you back." The wanderer stepped closer, his presence commanding the narrow space. "Gold rots, memories breathe. That is the lesson you traveled 1,000 miles to learn." Marcus took a ragged breath, the air in the cave feeling suddenly thin. He turned, his hands reaching out to grab the wanderer by the arm, to demand the next step, to ask how to start over. His fingers closed on nothing but cold, stagnant air. He spun around, his boots scraping against the uneven stone floor. The cave was empty. He scanned the corners, his eyes darting from the dark crevices to the narrow entrance. There was no sound of retreating footsteps, no rustle of fabric, no shift of gravel outside. The wanderer was gone, as if he had dissolved into the very shadows he had emerged from. Marcus stepped toward the entrance, his pulse thrumming against his ribs. He stopped, his gaze falling back to the mirror. The reflection stared back, but the space beside it remained vacant. The weight of the wanderer's presence had vanished, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the gold he had once hoarded. He stood in the center of the chamber, his hands hanging at his sides, the reality of his isolation settling into his bones. He looked at his own hands, then back at the mirror, realizing the journey had only just begun. Marcus walked toward the cave mouth, his boots crunching against the loose shale. He did not look back at the mirror. He did not search the shadows for the wanderer again. He reached the threshold and stepped into the cooling air of the evening. The horizon stretched out before him, a vast, unmapped expanse of darkening hills and distant, flickering lights. He stopped, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a single gold coin he had carried since the vault. He held it for a heartbeat, feeling the cold, dead weight against his palm. Then, he tossed it into the tall grass. It vanished without a sound. He took a deep breath, his lungs expanding fully for the first time in years. The air tasted of damp earth, pine needles, and the sharp metallic tang of coming rain. He turned his back on the cave and began to walk. His pace was steady, his stride lengthening as he moved away from the hollow silence. He did not know where the road led, and for the first time, he did not care. He kept walking, his shadow stretching long and thin across the ground. The fire crackled, casting long, dancing shadows against the stone walls of the canyon. Marcus sat on a flat rock, his hands calloused and stained with the dust of distant roads. He poked at the embers with a charred stick, watching the sparks spiral into the night air. His face was a map of deep lines, etched by decades of sun, wind, and mountain storms. He wore simple, durable fabrics, worn thin at the knees and elbows from constant movement. A few yards away, a traveler paused, his own pack resting heavily against his legs. He looked at Marcus, then at the modest camp, a small bedroll, a canteen, and the dying fire. The traveler scanned the ground, searching for the heavy chests or the glimmer of gold he expected to find. He found only the dirt and the stones. The traveler stepped closer, his boots crunching softly on the dry earth. He looked at Marcus, his brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "They say you were once the wealthiest man in the world, yet you sit here with nothing but a fire. Tell me, old man, are you rich?" Marcus finally looked up. The firelight caught the moisture in his eyes, making them shine with a clarity that startled the traveler. He let out a low, resonant laugh that seemed to echo against the canyon walls, shaking off the weight of the question. "I have no gold," Marcus said, his voice steady and warm. "But I have lived 1,000 lives." He gestured to the vast, dark expanse beyond the fire, his hands moving with the grace of a man who owned the horizon. Marcus did not wait for a response. He pushed himself up from the rock, his movements fluid and unburdened. He reached out, gathered his small pack, and slung it over his shoulder. He turned toward the path, his silhouette sharp against the rising moon. He stepped into the dark, his stride purposeful and light, already walking toward the next sunrise.